So as far back as we have data, the earliest Christian communities, 2nd and 3rd century, used a form of book material known as the Codex. Now, the Codex is what we would look at today as a book, a grouping of leaves of page, of parchment or of papyrus at the time, that are folded in the middle and have a outer cover bound around it. Now, it's important to note that while we're used to this, we're accustomed to this kind of book production, in the Greco-Roman world, especially in the 1st century, this was not the way that books were transmitted. This is not the way they were used. Granted, they did exist, but they were less than 1% of the book production at the time. And what we see by the time of the 3rd and 4th century, particularly the 4th century, is that the use of the Codex goes from 1% or less than 1% of the cultural use to over 56% of the cultural use. And what this should cause us to question is why, what caused this change, completely cultural change, cultural shift from one use of scroll material to this Codex form. And most every indication that we have points to the fact that Christians are responsible for it. Not that Christians created it, because it did exist prior to them, but that it is the Christian use and pre-production of Codex material that catapulted the Codex use into the 5th century onward as being the predominant book form in the culture. And we have to ask, why would they do that? Why would they change from using scrolls, as everybody else was doing, to using Codex material? And one of the speculations would be that it was more cost effective, but of course this doesn't really play out, because the use of different material for different types of codexes could be very expensive in some cases. Longer books would cost a lot more, and what's more, the margins on these manuscripts are very liberal. They're very wide margins, both on all sides, top and bottom. And there's no sense of needing to use the entire page. It does have the advantage of writing on both sides of the page, the right and the left side of the page, where the scroll material you could not do. So there's an advantage of adding more material, but not so much as using the entire length of the page. So cost-effective analysis doesn't really pan out. What does seem to be suggested by the excessive and sudden spread of the Codex, this isn't an evolutionary growth where you can map it becoming popular. It just almost explodes on the scene after the 1st century, is that the Codex offers an ability to contain multiple texts together. Whereas you could not do that with a scroll in the same way. So as we find codexes of the 4 Gospels, or collections of the Pauline letters, you see that the Christians in the earliest centuries clearly had a concept of starting to collect the books that they deemed were authoritative for their understanding of both the teachings of Christ and the history of his life. And so when we look at what caused it, what is the answer to why the Christians would use the Codex? Ultimately, or primarily, I think the answer would be that they had within their minds the purview of collecting a testament of books, or a covenant of books, that would become what we call the canon of the New Testament. One of the other artifacts that are really important as far as tracing back the beliefs and the existence of the earliest Christian church is the use of what's called the nomina sacra, or in some cases the nomina divina, the divine name or the sacred name. And what this is that in manuscripts, as far back as the earliest manuscripts we have in the 2nd century, we find the use of certain names, particularly the Greek names for Jesus, God, Lord, and Son, in reference to the Son of God, or Jesus, abbreviated. And they're abbreviated in a way that is unique to these names. The abbreviation is often, or consistently, the first letter and the second letter, or the first letter and the last letter of the name. So in the case of the Greek word for God, theos, you might have the theta and the s, or the sigma, at the end, and that's it. And then there would be a horizontal stroke across the top of it. In the case of Jesus, in the Greek it would be Jesus. You would have the iota, and the sigma with a line over it. Or if you were to find it in a different, perhaps in a different construct, in say a genitive, where you'd say Jesu with an upsilon at the end, you'd have the iota and the upsilon with the horizontal stroke over it, or Kyrios, which is Greek for Lord, which would be the kappa and the sigma with a horizontal stroke over the top of it. And these divine names, they pop up in the text repeatedly when used or applied to Jesus or God, always abbreviated, always marked. The origin of this divine name practice is really unknown, but what's fascinating about it is that without any kind of centralized communication ability, no magisterium, no head of the church, no head of manuscript production, we find this use universally in all the manuscript data that we have. And we see it even growing as the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries move on to encompass more names. But as early as we have, the names of God and Jesus are always used in this way. And for some purpose and in some way, this practice was communicated across the regions of the Christian world at that time, so that we see this used everywhere. Now, it, of course, seems to trace back a little bit, at least in some way, to be informed by the Jewish Tetragrammaton, or the abbreviation of the divine name of God, Yahweh. And in the same way, they apply it both to the Greek words for God, which are Kyrios and Theos. But what we see in the Christian community, and I think what informed us the most in relation to early Christology, is their immediate acceptance of applying that sacred name that would be reserved for God to Jesus, and the use of it when referred to Jesus as the Son, and exclusively when referred to Jesus. It's not as though every time you see the word Son, S-O-N, in the Greek text that it becomes a nomina sacra, but only when it's referring to Jesus as the Son of God or the Son of Man. And so we see this exclusive use and application of Jesus' name as a divine name, as a sacred name. So when there are people that would like to argue that there was no concept of a high Christology or a divinity of Christ prior to, say, 4th century Council of Nicaea, Athanasius writing on the Incarnation, things like that, they're not looking at the manuscript data that we have and the actual artifact evidence, which points to the fact that the earliest church records that we recall suggest that the Christian community already saw Jesus as divine. Last of the three artifacts I think are most important from the manuscript data that we have regarding early Christian belief is what's called the Storrow. Now, the Storrow is fairly lesser known in communities outside of manuscript specialists, papyrologists, and paleontologists, and those kind of things, but it's a valuable tool, especially even in the world of apologetics research, for defending an early Christology. And what it is it's a monogram, and what I mean by a monogram is that it is the taking of two letters from a word, usually the first and second letter of a word in Greek, and overlaying them across each other. The most popular and well-known of this, because it exists on Christian art throughout the centuries, is known as the key row. And the key row is a monogram of the Greek letter chi, which looks like an English letter X, and the row, which looks like a P to most Americans or non-Greek readers. And they apply these two over the top of each other. Of course, the key at a right angle kind of looks like a cross, and the row it simply just goes over the top of it. And what it would symbolize is the name of Christ, because Christos begins with key row. So you would see that symbol transmitted on tombs, on sepulchres, on shields, in art all over, and you can see it every day in Christian websites and things like that. And so the key row is the most popular monogram, and it points to an acknowledgement of Christ. However, there are others, but there is an earlier one than the key row, and it's one that is usually not referenced very often, and it's called the tau row. Now, the tau row is unlike the key row. In fact, it's unlike any of the other monograms because it doesn't come from the name of Jesus. It doesn't come from the name of Christ. It comes from no divine name. In fact, it is the letter tau, or T, and again the letter rho, overlaid against each other. And the significance of this is ultimately lost at first unless you understand how it's used in the manuscripts and what it appears to be. So the times when you will see the staurogram, and the reason it's called the staurogram or the tau row, is the use of the word stauros, or any version of that. And stauros is the noun form of the word cross. But not just any use of the word cross. You find in the manuscripts that this staurogram is written into the manuscripts at any location where the cross of Christ is mentioned. Now, if you look at the way a Greek T looks, we already have evidence through other writings that the T became used as a symbolic image of the cross of Christ. The tau was the cross of Christ. But if you overlay the rho on top of the tau, what you have is a pictographic reference to a person hanging on a cross. It looks as though the rho looks as though it's the head of a man hung on a cross. And what we find is an actual image, almost an iconography, the earliest of its kind, of Jesus hanging on the cross, written into the manuscripts that we have. And what the tau row tells us, what the staurogram tells us, is that from the earliest days of Christian writing and Christian belief, the crucifixion of Jesus, the cross of Christ, was a central tenet of the faith. It was the most important facet. And why this is important is because we have claims and accusations from other historians that there was no Christian iconography, no Christian art referencing a cross prior to Constantine's vision of a cross in the 4th century. Now, if that were true, that would be troubling. We would need to know why. Is the crucifixion of Christ a later embellishment? But as you can see, not only is that not true, we find depictions of the cross in some areas in tombs and things like that. But even before that, we have an example within the very manuscripts that we collect that the cross of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ was the central teaching of the church as early as they began book production. And so the staurogram actually serves as a much greater tool to defend the earliest Christian belief in a crucified Savior and a divine Christ than almost anything else that we have available to us.